Hello, everybody. Today's story is going to be the story of Mr. Chatterbox. Well, I think we know what Mr. Chatterbox is going to do all the time, don't we? So, what colour do we think Mr. Chatterbox is? I've no doubt many of you know, but he's got very fancy shoes. So, Mr. Chatterbox is sort of a pink, plum purple sort of colour. Probably pink. I think we'd probably call him a pink colour. He's got a bowler hat on. So that's like a lot of them wear these sorts of hats, actually, don't they? You'll see in a minute. And the hat, what colour is the hat? It is, of course, green. But perhaps the most distinctive thing about Mr. Chatterbox are his shoes. And the shoes are blue and white, so very smart. So there is Mr. Chatterbox with his top hat and his big smile and his blue and white shoes. So shall we see what Mr. Chatterbox has to chatter about? Now, Mr. Chatterbox was one of those people who, you'd be surprised to hear, simply couldn't stop talking. He used to talk to anybody and everybody about anything and everything. And he would go on and on and on. Does your mummy ever say that to you? Oh, you are such a chatterbox. And sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes it's just a bit too much, isn't it? In fact, Mr. Chatterbox would chatter on and on and on. And there you can see poor old Worm who just wants to go to bed. And still, Mr. Chatterbox is chatterboxing away. Chatter, chatter, chatter. Oh, and on and on and on. And here we are. It's the next morning. And he's still talking to poor old Mr. Worm, who hasn't had any sleep at all. And when he didn't have anybody else to talk to, who do you think he spoke to? He talked to himself. Some of my best conversations when I talk to myself. Good morning, Mr. Chatterbox, he used to say to himself. Good morning to you, he used to reply to himself. Nice day, isn't it? Lovely day, isn't it? It's so good for the time of year. And so on and on and on. He lived in a box-shaped house in a village. Oh, I see. So the house, look, is the same shape as a box. In fact, it was called Chatterbox Cottage. Chatter, 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 chatter. One morning the postman arrived with a letter for him. Morning, Mr. Chatterbox, said the postman. Now, when you talk and when you read a story, when I read a story, normally it has things like full stops so that I can stop for breath, doesn't it? Or it has commas, what we call punctuation. Mr. Chatterbox doesn't use punctuation. He just keeps talking. So if I get out of breath and go a bit purple, that's why. So here we go. Morning, Mr. Chatterbox, said the postman. Ah, good morning to you, postman, replied Mr. Chatterbox. Although, as I was saying to myself only yesterday, or was it the day before, I forget, however, it's not so good a morning in my opinion, but I might be wrong, I'm not very often, as it was the other day, Monday I think it was, or perhaps it was Tuesday. But never mind, because it is quite a good morning, don't you agree? Yes, of course you do, because that's what you said to me in the first place. And he went on and on all morning, and the poor postman was late delivering these letters. And that afternoon, Mr. Chatterbox went into the hat shop in the village. Perhaps he's going to get a new hat. Hello, Mr. Bowler, he said to the man who owned the hat shop. And there is the man who owns the hat shop in the brown suit. Do you think, if it's possible, that I could buy, if it's not too expensive, but I'm sure it won't be, a new hat? Because would you believe it? Yes, of course you would. But anyway, as I was saying, my present hat, the one on my head, as you can see, is getting, how can I put it, a little too old, because I've had it for, let me see now, it must be, let's think, 10 years. No, I know I tell a lie. It can't be that long, can it? Well, yes, it could be. But on the other hand, and he went on and on, all afternoon and half the night, long after poor Mr. Bowler should have shut up shop and gone home. Eventually, when Mr. Bowler managed to get a word in edgeways, or was it sideways? I don't know. He promised to order a new hat for Mr. Chatterbox. Then he pushed Mr. Chatterbox out of his shop, still talking, of course, and he went home for his supper, which was cold, of course, because Mr. Bowler Mrs. Bowler had cooked it for him hours ago. She was probably worried about where he was. So while Mr. Bowler ate his supper, he had a little think, and he thunked, and he thought a very clever thought. And exactly 1 week later, the new hat for Mr. Chatterbox arrived in a smart red hat box. It looks like another letterbox, doesn't it? At last, said Mr. Bowler, heaving a sigh of relief, I think this hat is going to be the answer to the problem of Mr. Chatterbox talking so much. Oh, I wish it could be, said the postman. But how can it? Because, replied Mr. Bowler, this hat is a magic hat. Oh, replied the postman, who didn't quite understand. That same afternoon, Mr. Bowler took the new hat round to Chatterbox Cottage. Oh, goody, said Mr. Chatterbox, seizing the hat box and opening it. It's my new hat, my lovely new hat. I couldn't wait for it to arrive. In fact, I got up early this morning because aren't I silly? I just knew. I didn't know how, but I really knew, that today will be the day. I don't know how I knew, but I knew, and it is. And here's my hat. And oh, isn't it beautiful? I can't wait to try it on. Oh, I do hope it suits me. Do you think you will? Yes, of course you do. And why don't you try it on? Said Mr. Bowler, grinning. Try it on? Yes, of course I must try it on. How silly of me to stand here chattering on when I haven't tried it on yet. Yes, I will absolutely, definitely try it on straight away because, as I said, it's silly just to talk about trying it on and then not try it on, isn't it? And so he took the hat out of the hat box and put it on. And as you can see, it was a beautiful hat. And can you see there's a sort of funny lines around the hat? I think that's how you know it's a magic hat. It has an aura about it. I say, he said, I must say, yes, I really must, that this hat is, yes, it really is. I say that it's one of the better hats I've ever seen in my life. And in my life, I must say, I have seen some hats. And furthermore, but while he was talking, a funny thing was happening. The more words that came out of Mr. Chatterbox's mouth, the larger his hat grew. And the more Mr. Chatterbox talked, the more the hat grew and grew, because you can see it's quite small when he puts it on, and then it grows and it grows, and I wonder what's going to happen. Mr. Chatterbox kept talking and the hat kept on growing. Look, all you can see are his shoes. I can't see anything, he said. Hey, 1 minute I was standing here looking at my new hat in the mirror, now all of a sudden without any warning, take me all hat on and all the way, just like that. And the hat grew down to his feet. And Mr. Chatterbox stopped talking. And as soon as he stopped talking, the hat grew smaller and smaller until it was the same size as when he'd first tried it on. And by the time it had shrunk again, Mr. Bowler had gone, because Mr. Chatterbox couldn't see him. And now Mr. Bowler, look, there he's got his own hat on. He's walking back to his shop. My special magic hat really works, he said. The following day, Mr. Chatterbox was out for a walk when he met the postman in the village. Hello, postman, he says. I say, do you like my new hat? Have you ever seen such a fine hat? I'm sure you know what a hat and... But you know what was happening, don't you? The hat grew and grew and grew the more Mr. Chatterbox talked. Now I know what Mr. Bowler meant by a magic hat, chuckled the postman. And he went on his way, leaving poor Mr. Chatterbox speechless. He thought, thinking. Not talking, but thinking. And there he is, under the hat again. And do you know something? That hat taught Mr. Chatterbox his lesson. And these days he doesn't talk half as much as he used to, or even a quarter as much. And you know the reason for that, don't you? Yes, of course you do. And in fact, there you can see him look, not saying very much, and poor old Worm looks a lot happier, doesn't he? Because he knows he's not going to have to carry on talking all day and all night. But just because you know, don't go chattering about it. In fact, it says here, keep it under your hat. And that's an old expression. We don't often say that very often anymore. But if you want to keep something secret, So if you don't want other people to know, so let's say you've bought a friend a really good birthday present, and it's a secret, isn't it? So you don't want them to know. What people sometimes say is, don't say anything about it. Keep it under your hat. Which doesn't mean you keep the present under your hat, because there probably wouldn't be room, would there? But it means you keep the secret under your hat where nobody can see it. And of course, these days, we don't wear hats anywhere near so much as we used to, do we? But once upon a time, everybody wore a hat all the time. So then it made sense. So that's what that means. To keep it under your hat means to keep it a secret. So that is the story of Mr Chatterbox. And if anybody says to you, you are a real little Mr Chatterbox or little Miss Chatterbox, that's what they mean. You are just talking so much. It's a good story. Hope you enjoyed that one. I think the next one I'm going to read is actually going to be Little Miss Helpful. So maybe you come back to me for that at another time. Hope you enjoyed that. Stay happy. Talk to you soon. Goodbye.